Intrusion Detection Systems. Alright, in this nugget we're going to be talking about Intrusion Detection Systems, or IDS. Now, in the first part of this, we're going to talk about just an overview of IDS, also as Network Intrusion Detection Systems. And a lot of this we've already covered in previous nuggets, so I'll address that a little bit. But we'll also talk about some of the important components of an IDS, as well as the main tool in IDS for the most part, and that would be Snort. We'll talk about some of the basics of Snort, which is actually a pretty big tool. Some people say that it's easy to use, but it's easy only in that there's not a lot of moving parts. Really, after the configuration, it's mostly just the rules that you have to work with, and then you have to monitor the alerts as they come in. And there's also the Snort rules that we'll talk about. There's really two main components of the Snort rules as well, and you need to know how to read a Snort rule. Also, the honeypot. Now, the honeypot is very useful for attracting hackers, and it's very good to understand and study what those hackers are doing. Alright, as I get started with this particular nugget, I want to wish you a Happy New Year. Yes, it's New Year's Day as I'm recording this, and I don't know what year you're going to be listening to this in, but I hope it's a good one for you. I tell you, I must be getting old because last night for New Year's Eve, I didn't do anything exciting. I was kind of sitting around downstairs, kind of trying to find something on television, and I heard my wife call from upstairs, and she said, "Hey, come on upstairs." I thought, okay. So I went upstairs and found out that she only needed me to help her clean out the bedroom closet. Yes, folks. Living the dream. Alright, as we get started here, though, we'll just first of all get with an overview of IDS, also known as Network Intrusion Detection Systems. First of all, much of what we talked about has been in previous discussions, especially as I talked about scanning, fingerprinting, all that sort of thing. You see, we're talking mostly about Module 16 here, which has to do with IDS, firewalls, things of that sort, if you've got your eye on the exam objectives. But again, much of that, including firewalls, in fact, has already been discussed. So I'm going to kind of just wrap up some loose ends here. Well, what do you do with a network intrusion detection system? You want to monitor the network. You're going to be doing this in promiscuous mode. Oops, let me write that again. Promiscuous mode. I'll just abbreviate that. And then you want to detect any suspicious activity. Once you've detected that, then you have to decide what course of action to take. It might be just a minor infraction, so to speak, or a minor alert, and maybe it'll just send you a text message or an email, or depending on your software product that you're using. Maybe it will block that IP address that it's detected that activity coming from. Most often you'll see these products in an intrusion detection system product, and that would be various things from Cisco, Juniper, Checkpoint. I'm just kind of naming the brands here. We're not going to talk about the specific products that they offer, but they're all very, very good. I've found that Bobby Metter's series on Checkpoint has been very easy to follow, especially, and it's really one of those that's kind of all-encompassing. It's not only a firewall solution, but it's also intrusion detection, and you can set up all kinds of pretty complicated rules depending on how involved you want to get with that. And then, of course, there's the gold standard, which is Snort. That's mostly going to be our discussion here because Snort is very often used in Linux operating systems, and it's also free. Now, as we talk about Snort basics here, understand that it's available for most operating systems. Of course, it's available for Windows, Mac OS, so it's a broad spectrum of distributions that you can use. However, I find that it's more normally used in Linux operating systems, and you'll see that as well, I think. It's pretty much considered the gold standard of intrusion detection. Now, I don't know why we always give it the label of a gold standard for IDS. It's probably because it's free, and therefore it's also widely used. As a result, it's also widely understood. There's a lot of people that know how to use it, and you'll find a lot of news groups and so forth where you can get a great deal of information exchange on things such as creating the rules and troubleshooting. Also, it's free. That's a big part of this, and the rules themselves are also free. You can download just kind of packages of rules because they can be quite involved and a lot to look through. Most of us would never come up with a bazillion rules all on our own. In fact, let me drag a window over here. I just happen to be working on a different machine here with a bunch of different rules, and this is just some FTP rules that I was working with. And you can see that, wow, that's a huge mess of who knows what. So that's just kind of how those rules are, and it's better if somebody else comes up with those, and then I download them, and maybe I need to modify them for my own purposes a little bit. But regardless, if there's a late-breaking vulnerability that's come out that can be detected by Snort, you can bet that within hours many times the rules will be updated on Snort. Now, those rules that are updated, the free ones are usually 30 days old. If you want the updates that are recent, that are extremely up to date, you have to register, and you do have to pay for a subscription service for that. But I think you'll find that it's really fairly modest, considering the 30-day bridge that you get in terms of the security. Also, there are several front ends available to Snort. Generally, it's a command line only tool, and then if you want to see any of the alerts, you can log those to log files, which can get to be extremely large. So in corporations, you'll normally log this to a SQL database instead. For Linux, normally you're going to be using MySQL, but you can also log it to any other database like Microsoft SQL or something like that. So again, you can use logs, again, small networks, or databases for larger implementations. Alright, now before we move on, I want to point out that it's really beyond the scope of this nugget, or this series even, to do an installation of Snort and configuring all of the rules and all of that sort of thing. Because even if you go through many of the step-by-step guides that are out there on doing a basic setup, probably take you an hour and a half, 2 hours. This is one of the guides that's out there, and it's available on the snort.org website. I've also put this link in your study guide, so you can reference that as well as another one on how to download and install Snort. But again, it's an hour and a half or two just doing this much, assuming you've already got the operating system, but this one also includes installing the operating system. But you can see there's several other packages you'll have to get, and it also involves installing MySQL, as well as a web front end that allow you to access and view all of the alerts and things like this. But regardless, I do strongly recommend that you at least download and install Snort, and you can use that guide. I think it's a pretty good guide there. Now, as it comes to the rules themselves, once you've got Snort installed, you have to understand that you only need to know the basics of how to configure or even just read a rule, but don't even necessarily have to be able to type one out from scratch. Normally, you just have to understand the various parts of it, and there's really two main parts: the header and the option. In the header, you'll see an action, a protocol, and a source or destination IP address and subnet mask, as well as a source and destination port. Okay, so that's all part of the header. Now I've got a few Snort rules that I'm just going to kind of bring up here in Notepad just for your reference. Again, you don't need to know how to create these all from scratch. In fact, some of these would be really hard to do from scratch. As you can see, like this bottom one here looks a little bit more complicated, but here's how it might look. First of all, if you take a look at the header part of this, that's everything on this side of the parentheses there, or parentheses there. Then you can see that this is an alert, and it's alerting on TCP traffic as opposed to, for example, UDP or some other kind of a protocol. And it's looking for traffic on any network and any port, but that's going to, in either direction, that's what the left and right arrows are, any direction, and any host to port 80. So we're looking at any traffic that's going to port 80. And then what we do in the parentheses here is we say, I want to see a message anytime that comes up, and the message is going to read in the quotation marks here, a test of web activity. I just want to see if I'm getting any web action here. Okay? And then we have a security identifier, or actually, I wouldn't call it a security identifier. It's a unique identifier, though. I don't want to confuse it with Microsoft SIDS. But it's a unique identifier starting at 1,000,000 for these alerts that you set up on your own, on your custom rules. And it's going to be, in this case, 1,000,001, and then there is the end of that. Now, the second part of this, in the parentheses that you see there, that's your option part. And that's where it will tell you, as you can see here, the specific alert message that you want it to say, the inspection criteria, in other words, what it's looking for, and what kind of an action to take. In the simple rule that I showed you just there, we didn't really have an inspection criteria because that was part of the header there, and we didn't really even have an action other than the fact that it's going to get logged. But at least that's the basics of a Snort rule. Let's go ahead and take a look at another one. And again, we don't need to exhaust all of these. I just want to show you some key points here. And this one is a little bit different. Again, any, but this time it's not bidirectional. It's only coming into our network at 192.168.1.0 with a 24-bit subnet mask, so it's a Class C. And in this case, we only want to see anything that's trying to come in on port 111. Okay. Also, we're looking for anything in the content, and it will look inside of the actual packets there for anything that has this in the packet. Now, what is that? Well, that could be anything. That could be a unique identifier for a specific kind of a virus or something like this, or maybe it's netcat probe of some or netcat kind of a shell that's trying to open up. Could be anything, but anything that contains that content is going to trigger this, and it's going to send a message that says Mount D access. Okay, so that's just an idea for a little bit of variety there on something else. Now, let's take a look at this next one. Here, we're going to alert TCP on any external network, okay, using any IP address or any port, excuse me, and that's coming into my network, which is my home network here. And we're going to take a look at this port number. Now, this is a signature for a backdoor signature for sub 7, okay, and what we'll want to do here is look for specific content in the packet. Again, for various types of viruses, trojans, exploits of various types, they may have a unique content inside of them somewhere, so that this particular combination of letters and numbers would only appear in a sub 7 exploit. Now, if that were to happen, then of course we would get an alert. And you can also see here that there's various references, so it'll actually do a reference here as well, and you'll see some of these that reference bug track documents and so forth. I would be very well aware of this last one in particular. Just take my word for it, and I would be very well aware of what you see here, okay, if you get my drift on that one. And if I need to come up with a reason for you, I'll just say that, sub 7 is a Trojan that's very, very destructive. How about that? Okay? Now, as a hacker, you need to understand how to detect an intrusion detection system. And one of the first things you might want to do there is, well, obviously, you're probably going to try to sniff the network promiscuously yourself, but before you even do that, you might want to know if they already have some device out there that is also promiscuously sniffing. And why would it do that? Well, it's only going to be able to detect malicious traffic if it's able to detect promiscuously, if it's able to sniff promiscuously, excuse me. So you can use a couple of different tools to do something like that. One of those would be anti-sniff, which can just detect promiscuous sniffing going on, and NEPED as well. You can just Google for those, or I also have a link for you in the study guide. And then you can also do this. This is kind of clever. Sniff for alert traffic. Why? Because if somebody's got Snort running, it's probably going to have several alerts throughout the day. Might even have hundreds of alerts or thousands of alerts throughout the day. And you can tune Snort so that it doesn't give you too many false positives and things, but regardless, there's going to be something going on there. And if you sniff for those alerts, then you'll know which system it's coming from. Also, how would you evade an IDS? One of the big keys there is you want to evade it using something called polymorphic shellcode. Remember we took a look at, let me just go back to this, something like sub 7 here, this particular alert. Well, something about sub 7, and honestly I don't even know exactly where this is in sub 7, but there's this unique signature, if you will, that appears in sub 7. So what somebody might do is they might be clever enough to fake it out, so that even though they're trying to exploit with sub 7, they're not using the original code, they're using polymorphic shell code. And the way that's done is it's still going to be ultimately the same code, but it can use add mutate or add mutates to modify that just enough so that it no longer matches any of the signatures or any of the alerts that Snort has. Notice you've identified which IDS it is that you're going up against. You can then start to attack the IDS. One of the things you can do is just look for weaknesses against Snort itself. I mean, Snort is a program designed by humans. Ultimately, if there isn't one found already, there's going to be some kind of a vulnerability within Snort on its own. And so you can go against that. Also, you can take a look at the operating system that it's on. If it's on Linux, look for a recent exploit on Linux. If it's on a Windows machine, you'll have plenty to choose from there. Look for the various services that will also be running on that machine and see if you can run an attack against those. Also, take a look at a couple of different tools. These are kind of cool. Stick and Snot. Okay, what these generally do is they will, for example, Stick will go through the rules that Snort generally has available, and it will go through and it will forcibly trigger an alert on every rule, and then it goes through a loop, and it just keeps going on and on and on, and it can trigger, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of alerts in a minute. Now, the advantage of that, of course, is you might be able to do a hack while all that's going on and while the administrators are trying to handle all of those false positives, and you're able to also attack without really being detected too obviously, because it's a needle in a haystack at that point. It's kind of a denial of service. You also need to be aware of honeypots, and these are simulations. They simulate vulnerable hosts on the network, and they are designed to attract attention from hackers. If there's more than one host, or hosts plural, then that would be considered a honey net. Now, what we want to do with these honeypots is to study what the hackers are doing, what kind of attack methods they're using, what kind of exploits they're deciding to use. And then once I find out the exploits they're attempting to use on my honeypot machines, then I can make darn good and sure that I've got the appropriate patch against my actual production machines. I also want to take a look at what the attack source is, where it's coming from, what IP address it's coming from. Let's see here. For example, I have a honeypot running over on another machine, and I'm just going to drag over a web page that I looked at there. When you work with these honeypots, they can send reports, and they can identify the source IP of the most events that's being triggered for the honeypots. Look, this one's triggered 14,856 from this IP address in the last 10 days. That's a very busy IP address, and that's likely to get blacklisted by something. But you get the idea there, as you can identify where the source is coming from. Also, you want to distract the hackers from your real targets. Now, depending on how clever you want to be with your honeypots, they can kind of be a study on their own, and they might be high maintenance. The one that I'm going to show you here in a moment is pretty low maintenance, and it's easy to set up. It's kind of just really for testing purposes. But if you make it pretty elaborate there, then they're going to think they're really attacking your network and that they're making potentially some headway, at least for a period of time. And that will help to distract them from attacking your actual resources. Also, as a rule, you generally do not want to connect a honeypot to your production network, because obviously it's an open target, and if it gets compromised with some kind of a virus or Trojan or something else that can compromise the rest of your network, then you've just opened yourself up to a huge launch pad. Then your honeypot really becomes a gigantic vulnerability to everything. The only exception to that might possibly be to use it kind of as a canary. And I'm misusing this term a little bit because it's used in other contexts as well, but it comes from an old term in mining. So that in the old days, miners would take canaries in their cages down to the mines. And if the canary died, that meant that there was some kind of a poisonous fume or something like that in the tunnels. Now, usually it would be enough to kill the canary first before it would start to affect the human. So if they see a dead canary, well, they'll just evacuate the tunnel. Kind of a similar thing would be with the honeypot. In this case, if you see your honeypot and it's behind the same firewalls, and if it has the same protections as your other hosts on the network, but if it seems to get compromised somehow, then you know that it's possible that very soon the rest of your machines could also get compromised. Also, check the legalities of having a honeypot. Before you even stick one out there, you may have to go through certain checks and balances through people in your network department and your other folks in your IT department and your legal department and so on, to see if it's even really a legit possibility for you to do this. This is just something to make sure that you haven't overlooked something, and so that you might put a honeypot out there that for some other reason would compromise the rest of your network. Now then, here, just by way of example, I'm just showing you a couple of things actually. Let me go up to the top here. But this is a product called HoneyBot, and it's free, and you can just download this from this web page right here, Atomic Software Solutions. Same place I got this report from that I showed you a little bit earlier. But the whole point of this is to set up a honeypot so that you can see where your attacks are coming from. For example, from 10.10.10.45, I have a lot of a lot of probes against this one. Look, this looks like it's probing for telnet traffic, DNS. What's that one? Of course, HTTP traffic. You know, so there's a lot of different things here. It looks like it's probing against. And if I go over to my Linux machine, you can see I kind of stacked the deck here because I had probed that after I set up this honeypot. For example, remember I told you way back when that a TCP scan is very noisy. Well, you can see that it's generated a lot of noise here, even on this honeypot, and we can see the traffic that's coming in. And over here's my backtrack machine. Let me just kind of line this up. And you can see here that I ran an Nmap TCP scan against 10.10.10.38, which is my honeypot. And what the result was, it looks like everything in the world is open over there. So this is kind of an obvious honeypot. What I would really want to do is I'd have to tweak this honeypot to leave only a few ports open. Like maybe I would fake that it's a web server and leave open 443 and 80, or fake that it's a DNS server and leave open TCP and UDP 53. You know, that sort of thing. But here we pretty much left everything open, at least it looks that way. And this might then distract a hacker into trying to go after this host right here, and then it would do some kind of a hack against, I don't know, whatever some of these different things are, a DNS or whatever, and it would be pretty much unsuccessful because I don't even actually have the DNS service running, even though it might look like I do. In this nugget, we talked about IDS, or Intrusion Detection Systems. We started off with an IDS overview, and remember, we covered a lot of IDS in previous nuggets, but we talked about some of the main components here of an IDS, one of those things being that Snort is probably the main product that's used out there, at least in a certified ethical hacker mindset. We talked about some of the Snort basics. Now remember, it does take a little while to set up Snort. You have to have other things in place, such as a way of reading the Snort alerts. You have to have a database if you're especially in a corporation, because the log files will fill up too soon otherwise. But you do need to know also about the Snort rules. Now you may not have to come up with your own rules in expert fashion, but you should be able to look at a rule and to identify the various components of it. We also talked about honeypots, which are a great way to attract attention from hackers so that you can study what they're doing, and also to distract them from actually making attacks on your real production network. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.